I am Dave or DJ Butler, and I'm going to read chapter one out of our novel, The Cunning Man. This is a our because I am one of two co-writers, Aaron Michael Ritchey being the other. This is a historical fantasy. It's kind of a Dust Bowl urban fantasy. It's set in 1935 Utah. It's about a Mormon sugar beet farmer who is also a practitioner of his Grandma Hettie's traditional magical lore and uses that power to fight the evils of the Great Depression. So here's chapter one. I've heard disturbing things about you. Bishop Smith was the youngest of the three men who made up the presiding bishopric, and his Van Dyke beard certainly made him the jauntiest. It jutted forward like a knife. Hiram Woolley felt his heart lurch like a toad in his chest. Bishop Wells, sitting in a chair beside Bishop Smith, had a face round as a pie and a cream-colored complexion. Behind round spectacle lenses, his eyes smiled, though the line of his mouth was flat. Smith and Wells were the counselors, number 2 and number 3, respectively. The presiding bishop himself, Bishop Cannon, wasn't with them. They had heard that Hiram was a magician. Smith and Wells both wore slacks and waistcoats, their jackets slung over the backs of chairs. Hiram was in his overalls with his faded olive green wool coat and his hat on his knee. The bishops wore polished black shoes, and Hiram had dirty Red Wing harvesters. Oh, he said. About you and your grandmother. Hettie, Hiram said. God rest her soul. She was a witch. No, Hiram said immediately. Bishop Smith leaned forward, nostrils flaring. And you have magical powers. Hiram ran the fingers of one hand through his thinning hair. He wanted to stand, put his fedora back on, and leave, but he owed respect to Bishop Smith, to the office at least, if not to the man. No, I don't. Jedediah Banks said that you caught a thief. Found out who it was using balls of clay that dissolved in a dishpan. Bishop Smith smirked. Hiram said nothing. And Beulah Wiseman said you doused her a new well when her old one dried up. Hiram wouldn't be the only douser in Utah. John Wells spoke in mild English tones. He and Hiram had met at a barn raising in Butlerville several years earlier. Hiram had taught John how to drive a straight nail, in the process of which he'd seen a protective layman, an amulet written on paper around Wells's neck. He'd driven Wells home that night, and Wells had told him of his experience as a child in Nottinghamshire, being healed of an abscess in his foot by a cunning woman named Granny Jenkins. There's more than one adulterer, too. Smith squinted at Hiram. Well, Hiram could repeat the simple truth that he didn't have magical powers, but that would make the final admission worse. I helped Beulah, and Jedediah too, and the thief, for that matter, got him to return Jedediah's mule and ask forgiveness. Smith steepled his fingers before him. And do you believe God gave you magical abilities? Hiram carefully controlled his breath to avoid sighing. Yes, he said. And no. You're being evasive, Smith frowned. Do you know James Anderson, an American Fork? At the People's State Bank, Hiram murmured. Jim Anderson was his loan officer. James Anderson is a faithful brother. Smith's frown twisted slowly into a smile. He is. Hiram's heart was thumping. I don't think Brother Anderson would want to have anything to do with witches. Like any farmer, Hiram was sometimes late in his payments, and his personal relationship with his bankers was the only thing that got him the days and sometimes weeks or months of grace he needed to stay afloat. I'm not trying to be evasive, Hiram said. Look, you're a healthy man with two legs. You walked into this room. Did God give you the power to walk? Smith looked suspicious. This is irrelevant. Wells smiled slightly. Let's hear him out, David. Hiram continued. Without God, you wouldn't walk. You wouldn't have legs. The earth you stand on wouldn't exist and wouldn't be spinning around to generate gravity. Anyway, that's what Michael says makes gravity. You can walk because of God, but that doesn't mean you have a special power of walking. You're just an ordinary man doing an ordinary thing in the world as God made it. In the same way, you could say that God gave you the power to read, or swim, or drive a car. I'm not a witch. Smith's voice was cold. Neither was Grandma Hettie. Hiram avoided making eye contact with John Wells, feeling he might implicate his friend, and neither am I. A witch is someone who hurts others, but I help people. That's what Brother Banks and Sister Wiseman both told you about me. So you would call yourself what, then? Was that a hint of triumph in Smith's eyes? A wizard? A charmer? It was a trap. Those words were both associated with condemnation in the Bible. Hiram shrugged. If people ask, I tell them I farm sugar beets, which is the truth. I would hate to have to drive home past the bank, Brother Woolley, Smith said. On the way here, I stopped to talk with Brother Anderson, and he told me you're late on your payments as we speak. The egg-shaped, red-flecked green stone Hiram always carried in his pocket, his bloodstone, or heliotropius, lay inert. So Bishop Smith was telling the truth. I'll catch up on payments. Harvest should be good this year. I hope you catch up in time. What could Hiram say that was safe? Grandma Hettie said that the things she did made her a cunning woman. I suppose that makes me a cunning man, though that's not a term you hear so much anymore. A wizard. Hiram shook his head. Just someone who knows how things work and who uses his knowledge for good. And this knowledge, these things you do, you're convinced they work. Hiram nodded. Ask Beulah and Jedediah in the mouth of two witnesses. Do they always work? Smith smirked. Or do they only sometimes work? Well, Hiram said, sometimes a man who knows perfectly well how to walk trips over his own feet anyway, or steps into a puddle or isn't looking where he's going, so he walks into a wall or someone else kicks his feet out from under him. You wouldn't say his walking only works some of the time. And some things depend on faith or a pure heart, mine or the person I'm helping, so yes, sometimes my lore fails. And does your lore include the use of sacred things? The hair on the back of Hiram's neck stood up. This was a dangerous question. Certain sacred names or gestures were very effective against illnesses or wicked spirits, especially if repeated multiple times. He shrugged slowly. If making the sign of the cross over a sick person or singing a psalm to an excited mule helps a person in need, then yes, I do it. Is this 1935 or 1835? Bishop Smith leaned back in his chair and looked at Bishop Wells. You really want to send this man to the Kimball mine as our representative? To say representative is a bit much. Wells smiled softly. We need someone to take food to the miners, and Hiram is ready to go. He does this sort of thing for me often. I trust him. The food's loaded on the back of my AA, Hiram said. 3 different Lehigh congregations pitched in, but I can unload it. I'm not the only man in town with a truck. Bishop Smith looked at the other 2 men through slitted eyes. Take the food to the men of Kimball Mine, Brother Woolley, he said, and then come back home. Don't do anything else, and don't imagine we won't hear if you do. Even in God-forsaken Helper, there are those who will tell us what happens. Smith stood with a dancer's grace, back erect, heels snapping sharply together, and left. The door fell shut behind him, and Hiram heard the clicking of his heels on the wooden floor of the halls. Hiram Woolley and John Wells stood more slowly, then shook hands. Maybe I should stop trying, Hiram suggested. Keep to myself, farm beets. Can you? Wells asked, the dark eyes in his cheese-like face glittering. Hiram grunted. Listen, Wells added as they walked together to the exit, the Kimball family, they followed older ways. Heber Kimball saw signs in the heavens back about 1835, Hiram nodded. Or do you mean polygamy? Both, Wells said. Tiankum was a polygamist like his father. Are you saying there's something more than a closed mine happening here? Hiram had been acting as unofficial assistant to John Wells since nearly the day they'd met. Sometimes John called on Hiram because of Hiram's farming skills or because he owned a truck. Other times he needed Hiram because Hiram was a cunning man. I don't know for sure, Wells said. Tiankum Kimball was said to have had prophetic gifts, and at least one of his children is mad. Keep your eyes open, stay out of trouble. Hiram grunted again and nodded. Could he stay out of trouble? He had to, for himself and for Michael. They left the building and Wells turned right, walking toward his dusty white terraplane parked under a black walnut tree. Hiram turned left and found his adopted son Michael waiting beside their Ford Model AA pickup truck, strumming on his Sears Roebuck guitar. Michael's birth parents had been Navajo, so the two looked nothing alike. Michael was stocky with a solid chest and a dark complexion, where Hiram was thin, rangy, and naturally pale. Hiram tended to introduce him as my son, Michael, not including any surname in order to avoid the thorny question whether Michael's last name was Woolley or Yazzie. Michael ended the blues song he'd been yodeling and put the guitar away. Hiram checked the apple crates and brown sacks of groceries in the back of the truck, piled so high the double A looked like one of the gypsy family vehicles he'd seen in France. He found them all secure, tightly roped to iron rings, along with Hiram's shovel, water cans, spare gas cans, camping gear, and toolbox. Michael drifted over. "You could have come inside," Hiram said. Michael snorted. "I feel like a hypocrite, Pap. What do they want you to do? What did they want to do? Tell you who to give the food to?" "Well, I already knew that. There's a mine foreman named Sorensen." Hiram climbed into the shotgun seat and Michael got behind the wheel. Michael drove because Hiram had fainting spells. Only occasionally, but often enough that he preferred Michael to drive. "Anything else they want to talk about?" Michael asked. Hiram tried to avoid lying directly to his son, but what if he needed to use a charm on this errand? "They had the idea that I've been carrying on Grandma Hettie's craft, her special skills." Michael started the truck. "You mean magic?" The sudden note of disdain in Michael's voice stabbed Hiram in the belly. "Yeah," he said, as the truck rolled from the church parking lot and turned south. "Crazy, I know."